When people use the notion of nature and say, I don't know, nature is threatened or the planet is threatened, it has the strange effect of unifying the answers. So we think when nature, we have the same nature, you and I, we are all the same nature. By consequence, it also unifies the policy. So people say, if nature is threatened, we know what to do, and we will find a solution. And it happens, to the great surprise at the end of the 20th century, that when people began to talk about nature, they realized that they were in complete disagreement about what to do. So nature does no longer have the capacity to unify. You and I don't live on the same planet is actually now completely true. Before, you and I don't live on the same planet just meant you disagree, we don't have the same religion, you don't have the same politics, I'm from the left, you are from the right. But now, you and I don't have the same planet. It means it's a different planet. You live somewhere, and on your planet there is no climate change, there is no threatening of biodiversity and so on and so forth. And on my planet, the biodiversity is crashing, and there is a climate change which is enormously important. The advantage of the notion of planet is that it's not just we have different view of the same planet, but we live on different planets. And the other advantage of planet is that it has attraction and repulsion, as we know from the system of the solar system. So the notion of planet has, for us, a very powerful way to dramatize the main issue of politics, of ecology, of the present moment in the 21st century.
It happens to be that it's not quite the same thing to live on a planet which is not affected by CO2, where you can exploit resources kind of endlessly, and to live in a planet which is fragile, which is being disturbed by human activity. In that sense, it's kind of obvious that people like Trump and people like Greta Thunberg don't live on the same planet, as Bruno Latour would have said. You have even people who literally want to live on another planet, such as Elon Musk, who wants to colonize Mars. You also have all of these movements of people who belong to different cosmogonies, different conceptions of the world, which never fitted within the imperial, let's say, within the imperialist agenda of globalization.
When I first met Fernando Palma Rodriguez, it was in Mexico, and it was really interesting because he was telling me about his experience when he was working in the United Kingdom as a construction worker and electrician. And he was telling me that it was as if all the time he was placed in front of a mirror where he would look at himself all the time. Whereas when he came back to Mexico, to his Nahua community, he started to see through that mirror. He started to see it as a window, and he started to see the landscape outside of his house, outside of his property, and feel that he was part of that landscape, that he was connected with it. So that highlights something very interesting about this exhibition, which we're trying to stress, which is that we don't want to take a multiculturalist approach, but a multinaturalist approach, to take back an expression from the anthropologist Vivero de Castro.
We start with the first planet of this fictional planetarium, which is the planet globalization, which, as its name indicates, is the result of international exchange, international trade, and which mainly developed itself from the 80s up until today, with a lot of traction, because it was promising, let's say, development, it was promising forms of like economic growth, in complete denial of the planetary limitations. We enter here in a room which is dealing with the notion of connectivity, which is so important in order to shape the planet globalization, and where we have different works which deal in some sort of way with the notion of the screen, but without using screens, but actually mediums such as sculptures and painting. Here is a piece by the artist Wang where she depicts the kind of mixed feelings that she has on her social media platforms, typical of this kind of situation of seeing horror and little pleasures always colliding with one another. And the sculptures by Jean Katangbayi, who's making these wonderful sort of abstract sculptures, which are actually built with references and materials connected to copper mining. Once you arrive within Planet Globalization, we have invited artists who were all depicting one different aspect of the kind of attraction that this planet could have. And a very strong example for this is the work by Franck Lebovici and Julien Serroussi. Two of them focused on an attack which happened in République démocratique du Congo, in a small village called Bogoro. And they worked with court practitioners, actual court practitioners, on experimenting different kind of methodologies in order to work with the evidences. What Julien Serroussi, who was himself a legal analyst in this court, and Franck Lebovici, who is an artist and a poet, did is that they said, look, let's try to experiment other ways of displaying those evidences. Let's try to put them as a sort of mood board, for example, like an artist or a designer would organize a studio, like, and let's see if there's not some kind of like new connections which occur. The artist doesn't pretend that he knows what he doesn't know. Of course, the international judges are much more qualified to talk about international law than an artist would be, so it's not a question about that. But it's a question of where he can intervene. And in this case, it's like how he can help the judges or the legal practitioners to change their workflow according to what he knows really well, which is how to organize visually information.
As you can see, these are paintings that are depicting architecture. Trejier, she's inspired, she makes a sort of patchwork between buildings that are coming from Africa, Asia, Europe. All of them has this heavy influence of postmodern architectural style. Now, what's interesting in here is to contrast this work with the former one by Millions, which is very much about the circulation of material. Where do the material come from to build a building like the Seagram buildings? How this circulation affects the Earth crust.
The artist Antonio Vega Macotela collaborated with people to make a tapestry about a sort of burning landscape. Inspiration from a Mexican poem which is talking about how smoke is the signal of something. That you have what looks a bit like a QR code. That's actually a technique called stenography, which means that it's an encryption of a code, a kind of secret message. The artist worked with hackers who used a list that they had found, that had leaked, of a bunch of tax evaders who pretty much refused to pay their taxes where they were living. This list is called the Lagarde list. It's pretty much like a piece about those globalized elites which don't feel that they are subject to the taxation of the place where they live. Where do all the people who feel betrayed by the planet globalization go? All the people who feel that they lost their jobs because of it, all the people who feel that the elites, the globalized elite, doesn't care about them, as we've seen in the work of Antonio Vega, where he leaks information about tax evaders. Well, those people decide to hide behind great walls. They ask to build some walls around their place, and we could argue that if they could live literally on another planet, they would do so. That's why we call this section the planet security. Some of the very important people to build that planet security were figures such as Steve Bannon, who is an advisor of Donald Trump, who helped him to win not this election, but the former one in 2016. But Steve Bannon was also a filmmaker who broadcasted and shaped, in many ways, the propaganda that was necessary in order to build the architecture, let's say, of that planet security. He organizes retrospectives where pretty much he looks at all the kinds of gimmicks that are used by Steve Bannon, and in his documentary, all the clichés which come back all the time, and therefore, by explaining how it works, the artist tries and hopes to show why it is efficient on the one hand, but also why it's extremely dangerous on the other hand. The artist Femke Hergraven is very interested by the imaginary of that panic room. And in it, she stages a sort of discussion between three extinct species, which are avatars of weird sort, which are discussing about the absence of the owner of the space, the absence of the last man. And they feel pretty lonely. They're on a lonely planet.
Now, of course, if you begin to see that globalization is a planet which is far away in space, but it goes somewhere else, suddenly you realize that there must be people who say, wait a minute, if we want to develop and there is only one Earth to provide our resources and not 5, what are we going to do? And those people, we call them those who wish to go to planet escape. They have realized that planet Earth will never be globalized. It's a sort of hyper-modernism. It's of course extraordinarily unequal. This is a planet for the not even 1%, it's a 0.1%. It dreams to go to a place where technology will solve all our problems and so on, but not for everybody. Only for those who are rich enough or wealthy enough to embark into this other planet. So this is the planet we call the planet escape. I've been interested for 40 years now in what is called the ecological question. And I've followed especially the development in the sciences of the Earth. And that has led me to study what happens to the very notion of nature. Because in the modernist tradition, in which I've been trained in Europe, we have a concept of nature, and it's this concept of nature that has been deeply modified by the ecological crisis. So suddenly we arrive in a world and we are not sure if it's the natural world or if it's a world transformed by technology, and it's a world impacted by the human, if we have to go back to the original notion of nature, the wilderness. So it's a very confusing situation. When you land on the planet terrestrial, you realize that there is no escape. You are literally locked down. You are not going to go to the other planet. You know that there is the only one which has been made over the billions of years by the life forms which have created this habitability condition, which is now threatened. And this planet terrestrial is very odd because it's the one in which we are supposed to be. But no, it's the one which we were constantly trying to escape to go somewhere else.
Zheng Yongda has worked with
instruments which are used by the critical zone scientists. In a way, he's worked with tools which are like mini landscape factories. It's like if you were having a sort of sculpture, but which wasn't created by the hand of the artist, but by the hand of an algorithm, which itself is replicating the current turbulation, the kind of turbulation you would have in that river in Taroko. So it's both a mini landscape factory and also a tool of musical composition in a way, because the sound composition in this piece, which is random, is extremely interesting. Su Yuxin, she does something quite different in the sense that she interrogates the position of the observer in this observatory, as the observer is never outside of the critical zone. He's always within that skin of the earth, within that kind of thin membrane. And so she draws very interesting parallels between what does it mean to be within as a scientist and what does it mean to be within as a filmmaker.
Cooking sections. Conducted a residency in Taiwan. So they went to the south of Taiwan, where there are several kind of fish farms that are pretty much taking and pumping water from the underground, and this results in the land sinking by approximately 10 centimeters per year. They met one person who was cultivating oysters, and oysters are very interesting because they do not require to pump water from the underground. And also they help to, let's say, stabilize water, or in a way build a healthy water system. So all that you see here are pigments, oyster grinded, all combined together, recreating a lounge, telling you about that very interesting inquiry that they conducted on the shoreline of Taiwan. You also have a cream that is made with residue of oyster being grinded that you can apply through your face as you're listening to the narration that is proposed by the two artists.
Liu Chuang makes a film. It started as a sci-fi narrative, but then very quickly it comes down to earth by putting a connection, a sort of really stunning shots about mines of places where lithium is being extracted from. But he also connects that to a tradition of polyphonic music, which are collective songs that are spread across Asia, but also from that region where the mining is being extracted from. It's interesting because he kind of creates a sort of surrealist connection between two very different ways of communicating. The one which is based on digital technology and lithium, and the other one which is based on polyphonic music. And one of the interesting things actually in this film is that the narrator is speaking in a local dialect called Muya, which is a spoken dialect, spoken by about 20,000 people, not in Mandarin, which creates a very interesting sort of way of approaching the story through a different lens, so to say.
We're really happy that we were able to launch an important commission to the artist Arui Kaumakan, who creates like some sort of sculptures with wools and other materials using lemikalik, which is a Paiwan technique, which consists in weaving into concentric circle. In 2009, there was a very violent typhoon in Taiwan, which displaced her and all of the members of her village. And therefore, how do you relocate once you've been moved out by kind of such a strong climatic disruption? Well, that's the question which is at the core of her work, where she tries to recreate through the weaving a form of connection between herself and all of the people from her village that she invites to work.
We don't really know what the terrestrial planet can look like. We don't really know how to picture or figure out this relationship between humans and non-humans entities. And therefore, it's very interesting to look at the way in which artists can imagine it, but also how filmmakers can imagine it, and how the dialogue between those different kind of intuitions, visual intuitions that those cineasts offer to us, can enter into a dialogue here, into what they've called, what the two cinema critics, Proudhon and Salty, have called new cinematic encounters.
This is a very important part of a show, is that scientists are suddenly discovering its fragility, its small size. This is the critical zone aspect, the fact that it's not the whole globe, it's not the whole planet Earth as it was imagined before. It's a very, very small strip of land and ocean, which is occupying a very small position. We try to help the visitors to land on the terrestrial, comparing it with the three others, and be surprised by the land, surprised by the Earth, that it has a very strange fragility, richness of connections, and which was not seen very well when you were only trying to use it to go somewhere else. And that's the effect we try to obtain from the visitors. Surprise, we have to stay here, to reside here, and to live with all these entities, the microbes, the viruses, all of those entities which we before saw only as a frame or as a milieu, but not as our partners in the lockdown, so to speak. So I'm very interested in the idea that the lockdown which we are going through because of a pandemic is actually a good entry into the terrestrial.
We're now in the planet with alternative gravity. We started to work on this section from a discussion with the artist Chen Yinru, who had made this very well-made astrological charts, pretty much. What she did is she took 6 different events of massacres in the recent history in Asia, and she looked at the planet's configuration on the nights of those massacres. And by doing that, she was kind of drawing a sort of connection, or at least raising up the question of how planetary alignment might influence human actions. And so when we had that discussion, of course, I was a bit resistant to it. I say of course, but at least in my view. And she started to tell me, look, Martin, there are those laws of physics. There are those laws of how planet influence us. Whether you accept those laws or you can walk away. And when she said that, I started to think, okay, we definitely don't live on the same planets, and therefore we should have a section exploring artists who are kind of looking at astrological ways of influencing human activity, or how alchemy could do this as well. Here we have a very impressive installation made by the artists June Balthazar and Pierre Pose, who work together as a duo. And they interrogate what void could be, or what holds matter together.
They managed to convince the Nobel Prize winner in astrophysics, Michel Mayor, and Chiara Mariotti at CERN to talk about her version of the void as well. And it happens to be that the two scientists have different models of understanding the void, in the sense that for the astrophysicist, void is empty, whereas for the particle physicist, it's filled with a vibratory field, which is the Higgs field. And that's one of the great mysteries right now of physics today, which is that those two theories work at their own scale, but we don't find a way to reconnect them, as if they were acting on separate planets in a way. The other film that they do, that the artists do, this time is not documentary based, but try to depict this sort of invisible matter. And so that brings us into a territory of imagination, of what this invisible matter might look like.
We need a way, which is a traditional way, which is called diplomacy. If you are divided among these different planets, it creates a space of dispute, and this space of dispute has to be instituted, ritualized, organized, so that people can stop fighting one another completely, or the planet goes in completely different direction. So this is why we say new diplomatic encounters. Taiwanese curator Eva Lin will be the one who has organized a simulation of those disputes with many scientists and scholars in Taiwan and activists, trying to show, okay, if we now have to invent those new diplomatic encounters, how could they be settled? And it's the invention of a process, invention of a procedures of diplomacy.
公共计划它的一个方法的途径之一，就是希望能够将不同背景的人邀请聚集在一个空间，尤其是意见不合的朋友们。对，所以其实我们这个跨学科它在讨论，并不是说像是在艺术圈的这种跨领域的概念。这个协商的一个很大的用意，就是在于是说，它其实并不是只是希望听到来自不同的声音而已，而是说这些不同的背景的人，他怎么样凝聚在一起。但我们要求的不是达成一个共识，某种层面借由亲近去产生一种认同。保持不同意见多元歧义的重要性，所以我们在创造的并不是某种的共识，我们其实是要增加更多的理解，我们才有可能去翻转这种目前已经似乎是不可逆的一个生态危机啊。
We have seen how different people were living on different planets within this show, which pretty much all of them have a different atmosphere, a different composition. And that's what we're trying to render. The fact that today with the ecological mutation, it's not the same thing to live in a planet where CO2 affects the atmosphere and in a planet which is unaffected by it. So again, we try to stage these different, let's say, representations of the world where people want to go towards, where people want to inhabit. And we accept the fact that there is a deep division with these different representations, but we have the hope, of course, that they can sort of try to negotiate with one another, that they can try to encounter with one another, in order not only to discuss and debate, but also literally to negotiate an agenda of what would be an inhabitable world in their perspectives.
When you curate an exhibition and that you are coming from abroad, I come from France and Martin comes from France, the critique is always, why is it here and not in Paris, or why is it here and not in New York? But the great interest of working with Taipei Museum of Art is that we, from the beginning, wanted to use the Taiwanese situation as a scale model for larger problem of the Earth. And it's very easy because, as I said before, the typical and canonical aspect of ecological and economical problems which are converging inside the island of Taiwan, in addition to the geopolitical question. If you accept that we are divided by the question of nature, every place where you are on Earth has to be highly specific. And the specificity of the exhibition is very well marked in the exhibition, I think, because of a collaboration with activists, artists, and scientists in Taiwan.